Hey everybody, this is Kate, aka Charlie.
And Haley from Clear Thoughts Foundation, and you're listening to Dementia Uncovered podcast.
More people than ever are being diagnosed with various forms of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease, FTD, and Lewy body, to name a few.
And so on this show, we are on a mission to sit down with industry experts, impacted individuals, researchers, and a whole slew of others to uncover the many aspects that make up this awful disease, so that we can shine a light on what we as a society can do to eliminate it.
This is Dementia Uncovered. Let's jump in. Welcome back, everyone, to the second episode of CTF's Dementia Uncovered podcast. As you heard in the intro, I'm one of our hosts. My name is Kate Finello, or sometimes you'll hear me referred to as Charlie, which is my very endearing nickname. I'm very excited to have my wonderful co-host here with me today, Haley Jameson.
Hello, everyone. I unfortunately don't have a nickname. Just call me Haley, I guess. But I'm happy to be here on the other side as a host of the podcast. If you haven't had a chance to listen to our first episode, I was on the other side as a guest. It was myself and the other two co-founders of Clear Thoughts sharing our own personal stories and experiences with dementia. And again, if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, check it out. We, again, share our stories and hopefully offer some bits of wisdom to help those out there that are experiencing the same struggles with dementia themselves or with a loved one. So check it out. And we're glad to have you today. And I'm happy to be on this side of the desk. So Thanks again for joining.
Happy to have you on this side. Feel free, guys. You can give that a listen on our website, on CTF's website, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and even iHeartRadio Podcasts. So hopefully within that list, there's an easily accessible to you, favorite listening app that you guys have. But we are really excited to be shooting our second episode today and to have a very special guest with us here. He is a pioneer in the dementia research space. He is challenging the traditional models of research. He is a published author. He is an esteemed Alzheimer's disease researcher, and somebody who we also have the pleasure of having serve as CTF's chief scientific advisor, among many other titles that he's obviously going to tell you about here in just a moment. Dr. Karl Herrup, thank you so much for joining on with us today.
Well, it is certainly my pleasure to be here and to be able to have this discussion with you. So great to join.
Well, Karl, before we go into some questions that we would love to hear your thoughts on, why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and the areas of dementia that you have focused on throughout your very distinguished career?
Right. I guess the easiest way to summarize my career for your listeners is I've been in the field of dementia research since 1992, which, if I can do the math real quick in my head, makes it over 20 years. And or maybe even over 30 years, longer than I like to think. I joined the Alzheimer's Center at Case Western Reserve University in 1992. Actually rose to become its director for 6 years while I was there in Cleveland, and then continued to be deeply involved in Alzheimer research and the larger question of dementia research. Ever since then, I had a peripatetic career, I think is the way it's been described. I spent 6 years as the head of cell biology and neuroscience at Rutgers University, and then moved to Hong Kong, where I was the director of life science at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And I moved back to Pittsburgh, which is my hometown, in 2019. And it's at that point that I got affiliated with CTF and joined as their chief scientific officer.
Karl, you should tell everybody that not only do we have a shared passion for dementia research, but we also bonded over fried pickles, right?
We did indeed bond over that, but
in case we have some listeners that share our love of fried pickles, so
we should probably keep that as a secret.
Well, now it's fully divulged,
now
right?
It's out. Okay.
For everybody. Yeah, wonderful. Well, we're definitely happy to have you, a part
Absolutely.
of Team CTF, Karl. You've been an amazing addition to the team and an amazing advisor. And I think we'd be remiss too if we didn't give you an opportunity to share with our listeners about your still recently published book.
Right.
Oh,
So, I mean, yeah, the book is entitled How Not to Study a Disease, the Story of Alzheimer's. And as the title suggests, I have a pretty bad attitude toward the direction in which dementia research writ large has been taking. It is, in fact, one of the reasons I got excited to join the CTF board, because I feel like the approach that is being taken here in Pittsburgh is unique and fresh. But what the book does is it it outlines sort of parallel histories of Alzheimer's, that, you know, what a patient experiences, what a physician goes through dealing with family with someone with dementia, and what a scientist such as myself goes through in trying to understand it. I would say it's pretty critical of some of the approaches that have been taken, some of the blind alleys I think we're running down. But it ends with what I hope is a hopeful note as to where I think we can go and straighten up and fly right. So thanks for that. Thanks for that opportunity.
yeah, sure, absolutely. I know I personally got a chance to read the book, and I think it's a good opportunity for individuals just to learn more about the disease research field for dementia specifically as a whole, you know, as well as, like you said, you know, get a better understanding of, you know, what families go through, and you know, ways that we can progress forward in the future.
Well, Karl, if our listeners want to grab a copy of the book, where can they go about? I believe it's Amazon, correct?
It's Amazon. You can order directly from MIT Press. It's any of the regular book outlets, and you know, it should be available. And if you have problems finding a copy, let me know.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So why don't we go ahead and on that note, why don't we jump into, I want to have you sort of talk through the hot topics, so to speak, of, you know, the dementia research field, of the news and releases of, you know, the 3 new dementia drugs that have come out, you know, specifically that are working to treat Alzheimer's disease. And, you know, why don't you give our listeners a layman overview of, you know, how these 3 monoclonal antibodies work, you know, the results that they're working to provide, as well as, you know, maybe even touch upon some of the successes and failures of the trials, in your opinion.
Sure. We could easily take up 3 or 4 podcasts with my.
I would imagine
it is a hot topic.
We could do one podcast per drug for sure.
It's a hot topic, and in many ways, it captures many of the themes that I expand on in the book. So it's quite an area. But let me do my best. There are 3 new drugs, and they have the unfortunate names of aducanumab, lecanemab, and donanemab. Fortunately, the first 2 have been renamed for the commercial sale. Aduhelm is the first one, and Leqembi is the second one. Donanemab has not been renamed yet, but probably will be shortly. All 3 are based on a singular idea about how Alzheimer's disease works. And it's important for people to understand that this is unique to Alzheimer's. It would not apply broadly to other forms of dementia. And that the theory that these monoclonals are based on is the idea that a particular peptide known as the amyloid beta or A beta peptide deposits in the brain, makes these sticky, waxy plugs in a person's brain, and that those plugs in some sort of cascade-like phenomenon are able to produce dementia. So if that's true, of course, then one way to deal with the dementia is to get rid of these A beta deposits. And so what all 3 of the monoclonal antibodies do is they target that peptide and help it get cleared from the brain. And in fact, if you look at the brain scans of people who have been on the drug, the treatment in pharma speak, if I will, hit its target, which is to say that after people were on the drug for 18 months, their what we call plaque burdens or deposit burdens, level of deposits, was reduced by 80%. So a huge success from a biochemical point of view, but none of us really cares if we have plaques in our brain if it doesn't make a difference. What we care about,
100%.
right? What we care about is, as I say in my book, can I play Scrabble with Grandma? And whether or not she has plaques in her brain doesn't matter. So then we get to the controversial part of these drugs. So all three drugs reduced the decline of cognition, that is mental ability, over the 18 months of the trial. The first point of contention, and this has been a hugely contentious area in my field, the number of pro and con editorials that are littering the clinical literature is unprecedented in my mind. But the controversy arises in three major areas. The first is probably the most important. Can I play Scrabble with Grandma? Does it work? And the answer depends on who you talk to. So if you listen to the media and certainly if you follow the drug company press releases, you'll hear figures bandied about how there was a 27%, it's often called improvement. If you listen to concerned people like myself, that 27% is much more sort of marketing than actual science. And let me put it this way. Everybody on drug, everybody in the trial, whether they were on the drug or not, got worse. And they got worse by a significant amount. In all three trials, the people whose brains had been cleared of these amyloid deposits, the A beta deposits, got worse more slowly, but they still got worse.
Sure. So it's a sliding scale of decline, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so what we're dealing with is a question of, well, can a patient or their physician or their families recognize that slowed decline within a single person? 27% sounds like a good number, except that it's on, if you look at the difference, it's 0.45 points on an 18-point scale, which means it's less than 5% and maybe more accurately 2.5%. Lots of studies have said that that difference on that scoring scale is not clinically detectable. It is not a meaningful decline, a meaningful difference. And so my feeling is that that there's something going on, that I, as a basic researcher, am interested in what the heck is going on. Why was this slowing achieved? But if I'm a patient or if I'm a physician, I'm going to say, okay, very interesting. Nice work. Go back to the drawing boards and let's get something that's clinically meaningful.
Okay. I believe, quick question, Karl, in that regard. I believe I had heard statistically that really even in the different trials that the best case scenarios you would perhaps see maybe a 3 to 4 month slower decline from the patient in the trial. Would you agree with that time frame?
That's arithmetically correct, but it makes the assumption that the rate of slowing is going to continue beyond the 18 months that they actually have data for. And we don't know that.
Yes. Okay.
And so I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth, if I might. and even if I might not, I'm still going to talk out of both sides on that. Something happened, and it is worth pursuing. I'm personally skeptical, but I'm really open-minded about what is going on. But that brings us to the second problem, which is we have gone so long without a new treatment for dementia or writ large, or even for Alzheimer's, that really anything we could offer a patient and their families would be just a godsend. Sure. If it was safe.
Sure.
And so that brings up the second issue, which is, I think by most criteria that I care about, these drugs are not really safe. Of the 17, there were 1,800 people in the 18-month trial. A lot of them dropped out, not a lot, but it's fair fraction dropped out. Of the ones who remained, almost 40% of them ended up with what are called imaging abnormalities in the brain. And that means if you go into an MRI and you look at the brain, there is swelling, so-called edema, and there were brain bleeds, which are known as hemorrhages. They're small hemorrhages, but bleeds nonetheless. Yeah. And they occurred in a huge fraction of the individuals in the trial. And by the end of the trial, in all three antibody cases, 3 participants died, and arguably that those deaths can be laid at the feet of the antibodies themselves. That's a pretty serious risk profile. I think it's, to me, it's troubling enough that I mean, I'm not a physician, I'm a basic researcher, but I would recommend against it based on that safety profile. I would doubly recommend against it because the benefit from these drugs is so minimal. So small gain, large risk. And that brings us to the third problem, which is they're hugely expensive. And the cost is such that as the Medicare system, it's almost a snowball effect. So because the FDA approved these drugs, it was almost baked into the cake that the Medicare would have to step up to the plate and begin to cover these therapies. It's estimated that with partial uptake, only for the most clearly identified people, that it would add to Medicare's annual budget $2 to $5 billion.
Wow.
So even if we're young and don't take the drug, it is going to impact our healthcare system in unfortunate ways.
Well, and Karl, isn't there a limitation too if people are even eligible for that? I mean, leaving the cost and associated expense aside, not everybody is even eligible to take them, correct? Like if there's any type of like pre-existing condition, even unrelated to dementia. But for instance, from personal experience, I know that folks have not been able to participate in certain drug trials because of AFib, for instance, or something like that, correct? So it's limited on who can even take it.
Yes,
correct?
Absolutely true. So if you're on blood thinners, it's recommended against. You should do a genetic screen because there's certain there's certain genes that raise the risk even higher. The way the approval went, you would need to be scanned with what's called a PET ligand before you start therapy to make sure you have these deposits in your brain. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Haley. This is something that would not be accessible even if you wanted it. And of course, what we're sort of bumping up against is how much these drugs begin to exacerbate the healthcare disparities. Who has access to treatment and who doesn't.
Right.
So.
The one drug, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Karl, you need to be registered as part of a national registry to participate, correct?
Yes, for both. I think for all the drugs that have been approved, but that's a low bar. They've set up a national website where data can be deposited, and if you're at a center that is has enough technology to actually do the pre-screen, do the monitoring during the infusions. It'll be easy for them to upload the data.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good.
So I'm sorry to be so negative. And I can talk out of the other side of my mouth right now because we are all desperate for something. And that includes those of us who are skeptical of this particular approach. And as I say, if it were safe and reasonably priced, just having the hope of a cure would, in my mind, be worth it. But I don't feel that way about these therapies.
Sure. I think an important part that you mentioned, though, too, is the idea that while they certainly have their shortcomings, right, at least it's giving hope to those that are struggling with a disease, that research is taking place and that new drugs and therapeutics are hopefully, even in addition to the 3 that were just released, hopefully there's more and better ones in the near future.
That is yes. I mean, that's certainly what brings me into work every day.
Right.
Yeah, that is the hope of a field with 50 years of research and finally starting to have something come through the pipeline that at least can hopefully be built off of, right? Maybe to form even better solutions. So
that is the hope.
Yes.
Well, that's a good lead in then perhaps to have you talk for a few moments, if you don't mind, Karl, about the CTF Consortium and how you feel that the work that the consortium, and for our listeners, if you could give a little overview of the doctors that we have part of the CTF Consortium and the work that they're doing and how you feel that that's adding to the success of the research field overall, and specifically how you feel the consortium model is different than what's been happening. Because I know, you were very honest in your words today, as you were in your book, of course, that historically you've not been real impressed with some of the research that's been out there. So you also mentioned that's one part of the reasons that you're excited to be our chief scientific advisor. So if you could share with our listeners why you feel the consortium model is different than what has historically not been successful and why you feel the model of the consortium has a better chance of success. And of course, touch upon what the researchers are doing would be great for our listeners as well.
Right. So there are 2 separate questions there. Let me unpack them separately.
Probably even maybe 3.
We come in twos.
It might have even been more like 3 or 4 questions in that, but
I'm just doing my best to make it seem simple.
You're doing a great job.
So let's start with the science. Sure. My feeling is that the science that's being done is taking a totally fresh approach to what are the causes of dementia, and to try and plant seeds in this fresh unplowed earth that will grow and sprout into new therapies. And let me just, as a quick aside, say it's pretty obvious, even to just about everybody in the field, that a single approach to a condition as complex as dementia is never going to be possible. This is, our brains are complicated. Sure. The way in which they fall apart in dementing illness is complicated. And to think that there is going to be a single silver bullet that will just magically make everything fine is extremely unlikely. So even if these monoclonal antibodies that we talked about, end up being refined and being successful, we will still need other arrows in our quiver to be able to go after this disease. CTF has done exactly that. So the science of what they're doing right now is focused on a compound called melatonin, and this is recognized. I mean, people on the podcast have probably heard of it. It's a sleep aid. Its levels rise and fall during our day, and it's high at night, and it helps us sleep. One of the scientific bases for what the science here is doing is that sleep disruptions are one of the first signals that there is a dementing illness involved. Said another way, people, certainly in Alzheimer's disease, which I know best, the sleep disruption is a major part of what goes on. And so the idea is that by readjusting the melatonin levels, we'll be able to approach dementia in a new way, and even if it itself is not a 100% cure, it'll be part of an armamentarium, part of a portfolio of approaches that's going to help significantly. So, in addition to that being, I think, scientifically fresh, the way in which CTF has gone about funding the research has been administratively fresh. So the model that CTF has used is that 2 heads are better than 1 and 3 heads are better than 2. And so the funding that CTF has provided is based on the idea that if we put together scientists who know each other but might normally not work together, and give them a common problem and say, I want you to sit down and give us your best thoughts and throw your ideas back and forth, bounce them off each other, take your different your different research expertises, and meld them into a single research program. And that's what CTF has been able to do. And so the three researchers who are involved are Amantha Thathia, a basic researcher in neurobiology at Pitt Medical School, Oscar Lopez, who's the head of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and Robert Friedlander, who's the chair of neurosurgery at UPMC. And these are 3 individuals who know each other, but got together and said, okay, how can we pool our resources, our intellectual resources, and pull together something that might be really meaningful? And it's an exciting model. It's fresh and somewhat new. It's been hugely successful, and the hope is that we can be able to grow it and make it even more so.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks for saying all that. And thanks for giving our listeners a really in-depth overview of, what they're working on and the researchers themselves, and really, what we've set out to do with with the idea of this novel collaborative model, right? Like you said, obviously 2 heads are better than 1 and 3 are better than 2. So, we hope to continue.
I'm going to quote you on that, Karl.
Right. It's pretty good. I was like,
that's a new quote. I'm using, I'm using that one. That's good.
Yeah. So very, very helpful to have our listeners be able to get a better understanding of that. And obviously we're going to try and continue to do our best to keep growing that in the best ways that we can. Right. And hopefully growing the ways in which they collaborate and the individuals that we bring in to collaborate together. Right. But okay, I have one more question for you, Karl, that I want to ask. And I'm pretty excited about this one because really I think it's the intent behind what our podcast is really all about. When we set out to launch the podcast, really, we want to try and help, ourselves and our listeners and society as a whole to start thinking on, what we can do and what we should be doing to help accelerate our impact on trying to eliminate this disease. And I truly believe, and I would probably assume that Haley believes it as well, that, if everybody wakes up and joins in this fight, with us, right, that we have the possibility to find those cures, right, and find the collection of cures, like you mentioned, right, it's not probably going to be one silver bullet, it's going to be a multitude of things, then we can give people, a longer, healthier, happier life that really they deserve to live. So really, in your opinion,
100%.
yeah, I'm curious to know, what can we and our listeners be doing to continue leading the charge of real and faster change and outcomes?
Wow.
That was a bunch of questions. That was more than I asked you.
That's a hard last question, isn't it? I don't know why we saved it to the end.
I think one thing I want to add too, Karl, in that regard is, I may have mentioned this even in our first podcast, but I would never wish this horrible disease upon anyone. But the one nice thing I think about some of the Hollywood news with the diagnosis, recent diagnosis of Bruce Willis and several folks, is that it at least is bringing awareness to this horrible disease. I think it's such a misunderstood and often undiagnosed disease. So I think from a standpoint of clear thoughts and what we're trying to do, it's hard to fundraise in general, right? And then it's even harder when you're fundraising for a disease that people don't quite understand that it is a disease, that it can be solved with funding and research and the brilliant minds that we have working on it today. So again, I would never wish this disease upon anyone, but I am thankful that it's getting some more recognition in the news, like we talk about, right? And even the release of these 3 recent drugs, while they have their problems, it at least is bringing up conversation and making people aware that there are people out there working to solve this terrible disease. And one of which, of course, is our brilliant doctors, as you mentioned, with the CTF Consortium. So just to sort of add on to Charlie's questions, there's even some more for you.
Well, if I can think back to what the original question was.
Yeah.
So the basic question was, what can people do? And I would answer it in 2 ways. The first one is maybe a little unexpected, but for any of your listeners, anyone on this podcast who's thinking about, donating, I would say, please. But what I would also say, and this is actually really important, is almost the thing we need most is your patience. I think what Haley said is absolutely true. There are a lot of really smart people and really dedicated people working in this field. And we have our professional disagreements. And as I say in the book, that's the furnace in which the steel that we need to forge the swords that are going to kill this monster are going to be fired. So that controversy, if you hear about it, you heard it from my lips. Understand that's a positive thing. That's the way that science works. But we need your patience because, as I said, there is no one silver bullet. We are going to make incremental progress. We are making incremental progress, but there's no shortchanging the fact that this progress does not come cheaply. These fine minds work in labs with expensive equipment. The resources and reagents that they use to do their research you can't go down to Dollar General and pick them up. You
make our jobs easier if you could, but
it make my job easier, certainly.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah, you know better than anybody.
Yes,
absolutely.
And so get involved. Make your contribution because and understand that we are all in it for the long run. And this is to use the old metaphor. This is not a sprint; it's a marathon. And so those would be my recommendations.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, I believe we're out of time today. I know, as you said, Karl, we could probably talk for a couple more hours easily, maybe a couple more days, right?
We'll have to have you on again.
Yes,
All right.
absolutely. So thank you so very much
My
for your
pleasure, of course.
expertise and sharing your wisdom and your years and years of knowledge. We greatly appreciate it. As Charlie said, we hope to welcome you on in the future as the dementia research continues and hear updates from you. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
I think that's the end. We're wrapping up then.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Thank you,
All right.
Karl, again for
My
myself
pleasure.
as well. And just a reminder to all of our listeners out there that you guys can find all the episodes of CTF's Dementia Uncovered podcast on.
There's only 2 so far right now, but
Only 2 so
there'll
far.
be more.
On a multitude of streaming apps: Spotify, Apple, Google, iHeartRadio, and then CTF's website, clearthoughtsfoundation.org. So thanks again, Karl. Thanks to all of you who are listening out there with us, and be sure to follow us for future episode releases of CTF's Dementia Uncovered podcast.